Hello, welcome to a video all about big books, but of course we're going to specifically be talking about big classics, which are of course the best kinds of big books. So I am actually doing a post-production introduction, if you want to call it that. I've already filmed and edited everything, and I know the video is a bit long, but we're only going to be talking about 7 books in the video. So I would like to give a disclaimer on the amount of plot that I'll be talking about for each book in case you're scared of spoilers, since I do talk about each book for so long. In terms of the plot of the book, I really only will talk about things that happen in the first few pages or the first chapter. So I kind of give you an idea of what you're going to start into when you read the book, but when it comes to the actual plot of the book, I really try to say as basically little as possible. The reason I talk so much about each book is because I really love going into detail about the history of a book, the time period that it was written in, what was going on at the time in that country, in the author's life, the life of the author and how that correlates to them writing the book, the circumstances under which they wrote the book, certain maybe ideas and themes that are prominent in the book. I just really like talking about all of that and going into the history and everything. So I do spend quite a bit of time talking about some of these books, but in terms of spoilers for the actual plot and big plot points and things like that, you should be safe. I don't think it's something you have to worry too much about, but in terms of what I'm considering a big book in this video. So when I initially thought, what's my minimum page number going to be? My, of course, immediate reaction was 800 pages. Obviously. Can a book be considered big if it's not at least 800 pages? But then I started thinking, I was like, wait a second. There are some absolute bangers in the 700 page range. So after some thinking, I decided to lower the minimum page requirement to 700 pages to be included in this video. Because there's some books in the 700 page range that are so good that you read and you're just like, is this even real? Is this a gift? Is this a marvel of humanity? Like, it's so good, and I just want to talk about them. So I decided to lower the page limit to 7, or page minimum to 700. We have to make exceptions for marvelous pieces of literature. It has to be done. So in this video, out of the 7 books, 2 of them are in the 700 page range. All the rest of them are over 800 pages. So don't worry. You're still going to get some big chunkers. I'm not going to only give you slim chunkers. You'll still get big books in the video. I am hoping to make more parts of this in the future, like a part 2, part 3, maybe even a part 4, because I definitely have read more than 7 big classics, but with how much I like to talk and how much I don't shut up, I really could only fit 7 into this video, or it just would have gone on too long. So I had to limit myself to 7, but there are still so many other big books that I would love to talk to you about. So I do hope that I will make more parts of this in the future. In terms of when I will get around to doing that, you know, maybe someday, hopefully not years from now, but maybe someday. I do really hope to make more parts of the video. And I already have the books listed out that I would do for other parts, but maybe someday. So really quick, I wanted to make this video because I obviously really love big classics. It's one of my favorite things ever, and I always love being in the middle of reading a big classic, and I'm always looking for more big classics to read. And so I'm always checking online, like digging and trying to find more and more big books. And so I thought, well, why don't I make a video where I introduce some big books I have read, so that if there are other people who are also looking for big books to read, whether because they want to start getting into reading big classics or they already love big classics and they're looking for new ones, maybe the video could give them a couple options that they might be interested in. So hopefully there is a book or two on here that might sound interesting to you and that you could check out. When I'm interested in a book, I always read the sample first before I actually get a full copy, whether from the library or from some free place online, or if I actually want to purchase it. I usually buy books used, but you can buy it however you want. Of course, read it however you want, doesn't matter. But if there's a book on here that sounds interesting to you, then you could maybe pick up a sample of it and then read that sample. And if you liked the sample, then you could go get a big copy and spend such glorious time reading the big chunker. So I really hope that you enjoy this video, and I really hope you find a book or two of a big classic that you would like to read and have a good time reading big books. Enjoy the video. What is going to be our first big book? We're gonna start off with a banger, because we're gonna start off with one of my favorite books of all time. It almost didn't make the list because I questioned, is it truly long enough? So this is going to be the shortest book on this list, but for such an exceptional piece of literature, I had to make an exception. Decrease the minimum page limit just a little bit. So this book is going to be the lowest page count on this list. It's 714 pages, so not really too big, but disclaimer, but while it might be the shortest book, it is a book that is so magnificent and full of so much that it could take you just as much time to read as our around 1,000 page books. So I think it's fine and it can count as a big book. We're gonna go to Russia. We're gonna go to Russia, of course. We're going to go to a fictional Russian town, so that's where this book takes place. I think maybe it's like near St. Petersburg, but it's a fictional Russian town. This book was published in parts from 1871 to 1872, and it is by one of my favorite authors of all time, Dostoevsky. What book is it, you might ask? It's Demons by Dostoevsky. This book is a book that makes me so happy. I love this book. I love it so much. This is such an amazing book to start off our lists of big books, because this is incredible. Again, not that big, 714, so it is the smallest book that's at least on this video, but again, I think it could take just as much time to read as some of the bigger books. And I think even after you're done reading it, the amount of times you'll want to think about it, go back and reread stuff, dig into things more. This qualifies as a big book. This gets to be on the list. This is such an incredible book. And it is a book that so many people do not like. I hear way more people dislike this book than I hear people enjoy it. People who have enjoyed other Dostoevsky books read this book and they either DNF it or finish it and say they don't like it and give a, horrible description of why they don't like it. It's so painful to me that so many people dislike this book. And after seeing so much of why people dislike it, I think really the main reason why people don't like the book is because they just don't get it. They just don't understand. And what I mean by that, I don't mean it jokingly, okay? I really think that going into this book knowing nothing probably isn't the best idea, because this book is truly representative of a time and place in Russian history. And I think to really appreciate this book and really understand every single thing these people are saying, you have to understand the background of this book, what was going on in Russia at the time, because this is a reaction to an event that happened in Russia. A lot of people say that they don't understand what the characters are saying, that they're just talking and they don't get it. They don't understand what they're going on and on about. And that's because there's each character in this book really is representative of a certain type of belief system that is perpetuating in Russia at the time. And I promise you, if you understand the history of Russia at the time and the background of this book, every single sentence in this book will feel like gold, like you're digging in a gold mine. It's so incredible and it's just so fascinating, and I just love it so much. So I would say, if you want to read this book, which you should of course, but if you want to read this book, it's probably best to maybe read an introduction first. Does this even have an introduction? It has a foreword. You can read an introduction. I know those can be spoilery, but honestly, I think even with a book like this, even if you were to get spoiled on things that happen in this book, I don't really think it's going to decrease your enjoyment at all, to be honest, because I don't think the major plot points are necessarily what is the gem of this book. It's really what they're talking about and all their discussions. You can read an introduction, or of course, I'll give you an introduction. Yeah, okay. I'll give you an introduction to the background, and then I'll just introduce you to some characters that you'll meet in this book in the very first chapter, basically. This is a book I could go on and on and on and on and on about in terms of an introduction to. There's so much background to this book that I could just talk forever about. But I'm not going to. I've actually thought about just making a whole video of just introducing the historical background to this book, because I just love it so much. I don't know, it's so interesting. It makes me so happy. Not that it's, not that it's a happy topic, but it's just, it's interesting. What can I say? But whatever, I'm gonna keep it shorter for this video, because of course we have a lot of books to get to. So let's get started. Actually, really quick. Okay, this is Demons, but it's also called The Devils and the Possessed. So if you see other books titled that, they're all the same book. It's just different translators translating the Russian title into English differently. But let's get started. So on November 21st of 1869, a man named Sergei Nikhaov ended the life of a man named Ivan Ivanov in Moscow at the Petrov Academy. And he did this at night and stuffed his body into the frozen lake and then hightailed it the heck out of Russia. And the reason for this is because Sergei Nikhaov was a revolutionary, specifically a nihilist revolutionary, and he was a very extreme. I mean, when you think of a radical, I think probably the most extreme types of people who are willing to do anything for their beliefs, come to mind. That's what Sergei Nikhaov is. He has a manifesto that he wrote that is really short if you want to read it, but it details how dedicated to his revolution he was. I mean, he believed any kind of violence was acceptable to achieve his revolutionary ideas. And he believed that as a revolutionary, you had to completely dedicate yourself to the idea. And a disagreement came to be because Ivan Ivanov started to disagree with the propaganda that Sergei Nikhaov believed in and would do. And I think he just had a lot of plans for further propaganda, and Ivan Ivanov didn't like this anymore, and so he wanted to leave. He didn't want to be a part of this radical group anymore. And him wanting to leave, him starting to go away from these radical ideas, is what led to Sergei Nikhaov ending his life. But this event kind of became the catalyst for Dostoevsky writing this book, because he wanted to write a book that could explain how can something like this happen. These radical ideas that clearly were the cause of this crime, how do people begin to adopt these radical ideas? How could so many people become so wrapped up in these revolutionary ideas? Because in Russia at the time, the youth, particularly university students, were overwhelmingly adopting radical ideas. And specifically, he also wanted to look at the connection between the liberal idealists of the 1840s, which he was a part of, Dostoevsky, versus the nihilist revolutionaries of the 1860s, which Sorryyyyy would be a part of. He wanted to also look at the connection between how do older generations, the beliefs and actions of older generations, affect the beliefs and actions of the younger generation. So how do older generations unknowingly produce radicalized youth? And he looks at that connection to kind of provide an answer to where these nihilist revolutionaries of the 1860s comes from. Because Dostoevsky himself was a part of these liberal idealists of the 1840s, and his involvement not just in the Petrushevsky circle, but particularly with a man named Speshnev. But Speshnev was a more radical member of the Petrushevsky circle. Speshnev believed that you should be willing to do any violence necessary, and he believed in he believed in propaganda for one, but he also believed in trying to incite a armed revolt amongst Russian peasantry. In this Petrushevsky circle, which was a literary group, well, it was a discussion group, and they discussed books, but they discussed banned books, banned literature. And in this group, which Dostoevsky was a part of, there became little sects of radicalized people because the leader of the group, the man who started it, Petrushevsky, hence Petrushevsky Circle, he didn't believe in using violence to attain reform in Russia. But you have members that do. And so they start forming their own little groups. And one of these groups forms around Speshnev. And Dostoevsky starts to follow Speshnev. What eventually does him in is Belinsky wrote a letter to Gogol, and this basically advocates for reform in Russia and speaks out against the Russian Orthodox Church and the monarchy in Russia. It advocated for the abolition of serfdom and the end of corporal punishment. Dostoevsky and a bunch of other people start reading this letter out, and they have plans to print the letter and then spread it throughout Russia as propaganda. And this eventually is what does him in. I believe the Tsar at the time was Nicholas the First. I think Nicholas the First was the Tsar at the time. And he basically has it to where anyone associated with this letter to Gogol gets arrested. So since Dostoevsky had read it aloud at meetings, Dostoevsky gets arrested, and that's how he is eventually sent to Siberia. There's just so much more I wish I could say. Like, there's just so much there, but I we have other books to get to, so I can't just go on and on about it. But basically, I'm trying to get you to understand that Dostoevsky was a part of these liberal idealists of the 1840s, and he had experience with radical beliefs, radical behavior. He spent a lot of time around people who were willing to do anything for their beliefs. So you can understand how there's so many people, real life people, who influence the characters in this book. This book just so wonderfully captures a time of political unrest in Russian history. It is so amazing. Like, it literally just feels like a snapshot of a time in Russia. And it's so good. It is just filled with radicals. I mean, all different kinds of radical beliefs. You have in here so many different kinds. You have anarchy influences, you have nihilism, you have atheism, you have socialism, you have positivism, you have the Slavophiles, meaninglessness, you have materialism, destruction, utilitarianism, propaganda, political movements. I mean, there's just so much in this book. Looking at the title, this is a reference to the epigraph, which has two quotes. There's two quotes. The first one is from Pushkin, the second one is from Luke, and the Luke one, I would say, pay particular interest in. The very first chapter of this book is called Instead of an Introduction. And in this first chapter, you're going to meet some essential characters. You're going to meet Stefan Verkovinsky, you're going to meet Varvara Stavrogin, you're going to meet Labutin, you're going to meet Shatov, and you're going to meet Virginsky. So Stefan, all these people, by the way, represent liberal idealists of the 1840s. And Stefan Verkovinsky, he lives at Varvara's house, her estate. Again, it takes place in a fictional Russian town, and a lot of stuff happens at Varvara's estate. And Stefan Actually, I say Stefan. Is it Stepan? I actually don't know how to say his first name. I always say Stefan, like Stefano, but I don't, maybe Stepan. I'm probably saying his name wrong. I've never heard anyone say his name. I just say Stefan. That's how I've always said it, but I probably saying it wrong. I don't know. But anyways, Stefan lives at Varvara's house. They're not romantically, they're not married, anything like that. But he lives at her house. He used to tutor her son, who is a very important character in this book. But he lives at her house, and every so often, like, I don't know if it's every week, but frequently, Liputin, Shatov, and Virginsky come over and they have meetings, discussions with Stefan at Varvara's house. So in this first chapter, you just meet all 5 of these people, I think. Yes, all 5 of them. You get introduced to them, and you get introduced, importantly, to each of their beliefs, how each of them think, and kind of what each of them are representing in this book. And then the second chapter begins with you being introduced to who are going to be representing the nihilist revolutionaries of the 1860s. So Stefan Verkovensky has a son, Peter Verkovensky, and Varvara Stavrogin has a son, Nikolai Stavrogin. These both are nihilist revolutionaries of the 1860s, and Nikolai Stavrogin in particular is kind of the main character of the book, if you will. There's tons of characters, but he is kind of the backbone of this book. My favorite character is Kirillov. This book is chaotic, but it's so wonderfully chaotic, and I think it perfectly encapsulates a chaotic time. And I think his chaotic writing style works so well for this kind of topic. And I also think that this book is really interesting in context of what happens in Russia in the following century. I mean, in this book, he's warning about these radical ideas that he's seeing begin in the youth in Russia, and he's warning about the destruction that this can cause. And it's so interesting and sad to see how what he warns about in this book comes true in the 20th century, and seeing how much destruction and terror was caused by radical leaders in Russia in the 20th century, and how much their people suffered because of it. And it's really sad, honestly, when you think about it in that context, seeing how Dostoevsky was basically able to predict where these things would be headed. I mean, the following century kind of proved him right. So this is just a great book. You should totally read it. It has my heart. I love it so much. I love it. I love it. And I highly recommend it as a big book option. For a while, there was talk of us around town, that our circle was a hotbed of free thinking, depravity, and godlessness. And this rumor has always persisted. Yet what we had was only the most innocent, nice, perfectly Russian, jolly liberal chatter. Higher liberalism and the higher liberal, that is, a liberal without any aim, are possible only in Russia. Stepan Trofimovich, like any witty man, needed a listener, and besides, he needed an awareness that he was fulfilling the high duty of the propaganda of ideas. And finally, one also needs someone to drink champagne with, over the wine exchanging jolly little thoughts of a certain sort about Russia and the Russian spirit, about God in general and the Russian God in particular. For the 100th time repeating scandalous Russian anecdotes known to everyone and repeated by everyone. We were not above local gossip either, and here sometimes reached to the point of stern and highly moral verdicts. For the next book, we're going to go to Japan. This is a book that I have talked about before. It was published serially in a newspaper from 1935 to 1939. And it is Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa. This is 970 pages. So Eiji Yoshikawa was a pretty famous Japanese author. He was famous for writing historical fiction, which that's what this is. And he typically would rewrite pre-existing Japanese classics. He would write them in like a modern retelling. But he also did a few Chinese classics, because I think he, during World War II, when the Japanese were invading China. I believe he went, and it was there that he discovered Chinese classics, like got into Chinese classics. So I believe he has even written his own version of, I think, Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Water Margin. But most of his focus was on Japanese classics. I believe he has his own version of like The Tale of Genji, and I actually have one. Okay, he also, right here, yeah. He also wrote the Heike story, which is a retelling of the Tale of the Heike, which is a classic from the Kamakura period, like the end of the Heian Japan period, beginning of Kamakura period. And he has a retelling called the Heike story. But it's just not big enough. It's sorry, it's just not. Should have made it longer if he wanted it to be in this video. What can I say? But Musashi can be in this video. And Musashi is an historical fiction again, but this one's not a retelling of a classic. Instead, it's just based on a historical figure in Japan known as Miyamoto Musashi. Miyamoto Musashi lived in the late 1500s through like the first half of the I think he died in like 1640s or something. I don't know, late 1500s, early 1600s, or first half of 1600s. And he was a very accomplished samurai. He wrote the Book of Five Rings, which you can still read today. And he developed the two-sword technique. I would say it's best not to know anything about Musashi before you read this book. I thought it was really fun to read the book and then afterwards look up the real Miyamoto Musashi and see what things were different, what things were the same, because again, this is a historical fiction, so a lot of the main events of Miyamoto Musashi's life are the same, but there's also things that Eiji Yoshikawa adds to make it a more interesting story, to embellish it a bit. It's a fiction, it's not a non-fiction, okay? So that you understand what I'm saying. And it begins, like when the book begins, you're just thrown into the end of the Battle of Sekigahara. I'll read you like the very beginning. Like this is the first chapter. No spoilers. Just first chapter, okay? Okay. Takezo lay among the corpses. There were thousands of them. The whole world's gone crazy, he thought dimly. A man might as well be a dead leaf, floating in the autumn breeze. He himself looked like one of the lifeless bodies surrounding him. He tried to raise his head, but could only lift it a few inches from the ground. He couldn't remember ever feeling so weak. How long have I been here? He wondered. Flies came buzzing round his head. He wanted to brush them away, but couldn't even muster the energy to raise his arm. It was stiff, almost brittle, like the rest of his body. I must have been out for quite a while, he thought, wiggling one finger at a time. Little did he know he was wounded, with 2 bullets lodged firmly in his thigh. Low, dark clouds shifted ominously across the sky. The night before, sometime between midnight and dawn, a blinding rain had drenched the plain of Sekigahara. It was now past noon on the 15th of the 9th month of 1600. Though the typhoon had passed, now and then fresh torrents of rain would fall on the corpses and on Takezo's upturned face. Each time it came, he'd open and close his mouth like a fish, trying to drink in the droplets. It's like the water they wipe a dying man's lips with, he reflected, savoring each bit of moisture. His head was numb, his thoughts the fleeting shadows of delirium. So that's just the first little bit of it to just give you a taste. I think this would appeal to the most people. I think it's the easiest to read out of all of them. I think it's the most entertaining. Well, I mean entertaining in the sense that it has a very fast plot. It's very fast-paced. A lot of stuff's happening. This has so many cool characters. I mean, Eiji Yoshikawa's ability to write entertaining, vivid characters is so good. Like, he was talented at it because the characters in this book, like every single character that you come across in this book is so entertaining and so interesting. And even like the villains, the bad characters, like they're just so fun. And there's also so many funny moments in this book. I think most people would find this enjoyable. I think it would appeal to the widest audience out of any book on this list. I think this is a book that even people who feel like they don't want to read classics, they don't like classics, they're scared of them or something, I think this is a book that even they could read. I simply want to pass on to you the Buddha's teaching on the fate of women. This woman's fate is none of your business. He must be awfully important. That's what I want to be when I grow up. Important? You shouldn't aim so low. What do you mean? Look at Mount Fuji. I'll never be like Mount Fuji. Instead of wanting to be like this or that, make yourself into a silent, immovable giant. That's what the mountain is. Don't waste your time trying to impress people. If you become the sort of man people can respect, they'll respect you without your doing anything. I wouldn't call Musashi ordinary, but he is. That's what's extraordinary about him. He's not content with relying on whatever natural gifts he may have. Knowing he's ordinary, he's always trying to improve himself. No one appreciates the agonizing effort he's had to make. Now that his years of training have yielded such spectacular results, everyone's talking about his God-given talent. That's how men who don't try very hard comfort themselves. For the next book, we're going to go back to one of my favorite literary places, which is Russia. This book is one of the smallers also of the list. It's under 800 pages, it's 741 pages, and it was originally written in 1958, but it wouldn't be published until 1968, and then there are a lot of subsequent publications after that, but the book that I'm talking about is In the First Circle by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. When I say this was written in 1958 and not published until 1968, it was published in 1968, but it was published in the West in English in 1968, and then the full uncensored Russian version, I believe, was published in the West in 1978. And it wouldn't actually be published in Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. So when it comes to the title In the First Circle, you want to make sure that if you purchase this book, you are buying the book that says In the First Circle, because there's also an edition of this, or multiple editions of it, that are titled The First Circle. The difference between these two is that In the First Circle is the uncensored version. When Solzhenitsyn wrote this book initially, he censored it himself, so he wrote it in entirety as he wanted it, and then he censored it, took out chapters, removed certain themes and things, so that he could hopefully get it published in Russia. He was hoping to get it past the Russian censorship. Sadly, this wasn't the case. It still was not able to be published in Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union. The uncensored version in English was published in 2009 for the very first time. Before that, it was only the censored version. So when it was published originally in English in the West in 1968, that was the censored version. The uncensored version wouldn't come to English until 2009. So yeah, just a heads up regarding the title. Make sure it has the in at the beginning, because that tells you whether it's censored or uncensored. So this book is based off of, just like all of Solzhenitsyn's books really, or his fiction books at least, are based off of Solzhenitsyn's own experience in a sharashka. And a sharashka is basically a type of Russian prison during the Soviet Union where the prisoners were forced to work on scientific projects that would aid the Soviet government. So diving more into Solzhenitsyn's life, he basically entered the army in 1941, and then in 1945 he was arrested and sentenced to 8 years of hard labor. He was arrested as a political prisoner, which meant that he basically had said, so he'd sent private letters between him and a friend, and in it they were using code names to criticize Stalin and the government. And the government eventually gets hold of one of these letters, and quite obvious who these code names are meant to be, and so they use that as a reason to go through all of his other private letters and private writings, and he gets arrested for criticizing the government. And again, he gets sentenced to 8 years, and during this time he goes to a sharashka, hence why he eventually writes this book. But he also goes to lots of other different prison camps. He says in the Gulag Archipelago, actually, which is also a chonker, but we're not going to talk about that in this video. But he says in the Gulag Archipelago that it was really common for prisoners not to stay in one place the whole time. They will get switched around a lot. And so during all of his time of being switched around a lot, he did go to Sorryyyyy, but he also went to a hard labor prison camp, multiple different ones. His most popular book, at least from what I hear, is One Day in the Life of Ivan Dinovich, which I've also read, but it's not a chunker, so it can't be recommended in this video, but it is a good book, and it's very short, and that one takes place in a hard labor prison camp, because he also had experience there. He also has a book, Cancer Ward, which takes place in a, as the title suggests, a cancer ward, because he had experience in that. To get to how he was in a cancer ward, he would do his 8 years of hard labor, and then he would get out, and he would, I believe he was only free for about a month before the government decided to extend his prison sentence eternally, basically. He gets sentenced to internal exile in Kazakhstan. So he goes to Kazakhstan, and he works as a math/physics teacher, and he had cancer and ended up in a cancer ward. And that's where the book Cancer Ward comes from his experience there. But he doesn't have to serve in internal exile for that long, because there's what's known as the Khrushchev thaw, which is basically when a man named, I believe his first name's Nikolai Khrushchev. I know his last name's Khrushchev. Nikolai Khrushchev. He goes in power in the Soviet Union, and he basically relaxes the censorship laws, and millions of political prisoners get their sentences reduced or get set free, and Solzhenitsyn is one of those. So he didn't actually have to be in internal exile for that long. He got out during this time, but eventually Khrushchev leaves power, and these censorship laws tighten up again, and his books are no longer able to be published. So he wouldn't have any more books published in Russia until the fall of the Soviet Union. And then all of his books that he'd written are finally able to be released in Russia, because up to that point, he'd just been releasing them all in the West. And he did eventually get his Russian citizenship taken away because of the things he was writing. Although I believe specifically it was because of his Gulag Archipelago. I believe it was that specifically that led to him getting his citizenship revoked. But whether it was his writings as a whole, or if it was really just the work he was doing on the Gulag Archipelago itself, he got his citizenship taken away, and he ended up moving to Vermont in the US. And one thing that's like kind of a bittersweet ending, though, is at the end of his life, once the Soviet Union falls, he is able to return to Russia, because he really loved Russia, and I don't think he liked being in the United States. So it is happy, though, that he was able to return to his native land, and he wasn't in exile for the whole rest of his life. So that's a nice happy ending for him, I guess. I don't really know how the end of his life fared out, but at least he was able to go back to Russia, his homeland. It's exciting for him. Solzhenitsyn aside, what is the book actually about? Well, like I said, it's about his experience in a Sorryyyyy. So it takes place in a Sorryyyyy called Marfino. I don't know why I said it like that. In a Marfino. It is from tons of different perspectives, which when I originally saw that, I was like, would I enjoy that? But I loved it. I loved all the different perspectives, because there is tons of different characters, and you're constantly like each chapter is a different perspective, but it's still so psychological, and you still get such a deep look into each of these individuals that I just love it. I love it so much. I love books that really delve into how people think, and this book does that, and I loved it. So again, there's so many different characters, because what this looks at is it kind of just narrows in on this prison, Marfino, and just kind of looks at every person involved. So you get a lot of perspectives from the Zeks, which are what the prisoners in Sorryyyyy call themselves. So you get lots of different Zeks, but you also get a lot of different of the guards, like perspectives from the guards who were in the place, also the commanders, and even from, it's not a huge part, but there's even a part from Stalin. And so you're just seeing how, like specifically when you look at the Zeks, how do they deal with being in this prison? And not just being in this prison, but how do they deal with the way that their life has turned, and a lot of them being put in prison unjustly and for such irrelevant small things. At least, to me they seem irrelevant, but to Soviet Union were considered crimes. And how do they deal with this, having their freedom taken away and living in this environment? And actually, going back to the title of the book, In the First Circle, this gives you an idea of what kind of prison this is, what kind of environment it is, what they're doing here, how they're treated, because it refers to, in the very beginning of the book, a statement that one of the Zeks makes to a newcomer. So you have a new Zek who has entered into the Sharashka, and he's just come from the hard labor prison camps, and he's very surprised by how well treated they are, how nice everything is here. And he gets a reply from one of the Zeks who's been there longer, and he says, "What a place. To think that tomorrow I won't be driven into icy water. I'll get 40 grams of butter. There'll be black bread on the tables. Books aren't forbidden. You can shave yourself. Guards don't beat Zeks. What a great day. What radiant heights. Maybe I'm dead? Maybe I'm dreaming. I feel as though I'm in heaven." No, my dear sir, you're still in hell. Only you've ascended to its highest and best circle, the first. You were asking what a Sharashka is. You could say it was invented by Dante. He was at his wit's end as to where to put the ancient sages. It was his Christian duty to consign those heathens to hell. But a Renaissance conscience couldn't reconcile itself to lumping those luminaries in with the rest of the sinners and condemning them to physical torment. So Dante imagined a special place for them in hell. So there are way worse prisons that you could be in right now, but this is still a prison. So it's in the first circle. And typically the people that get put in the Sharashka were people who had previous scientific training. So in the case of Solzhenitsyn, he had got a math degree prior to joining the army. And so hence, once he was in prison, the Soviet Union thought that they could use this to their advantage. And so he gets sent to this secret prison, this Sharashka, where he is put to work on projects that are supposed to aid the Soviet Union with scientific advancement. And this is just a really interesting book. I love all the different people that you get to explore and to look at this prison as a whole and then individually, and just seeing how it works, how it runs, and all the different kinds of beliefs and mindsets that are all shoved into this one place. I really like it. I really recommend it. And I think you should read it because it's really good. Indifference, the organism's last self-preservative reaction, has become our defining characteristic. Hence, also the popularity of vodka, unprecedented even by Russian standards. This is the terrible indifference of the man who sees his life not cracked, not chipped, but shattered, so fouled up that only alcoholic oblivion makes living still worthwhile. All right, for our next book, we're going to go to France for a story that was published serially between the years 1841 and 1842. This is going to be our highest page count book, whatever, on this list, clocking in at 1,411 pages. And it was written by an author who wrote under a pseudonym, and she was a leading author during the French Romantic movement. And that is Consuelo by George Sand. Now, this is, okay, well, actually, wait. George Sand was her pseudonym. Her real name's really long, but I'm pretty sure when people would refer to her, because obviously in real, outside of her pseudonym, people didn't call her this in real life. I believe they referred to her as Aurora, because that's commonly what I see her referred to as, is Aurora. This might not look like the 1,400 pages, and that's because there's 2 volumes to this. I think a lot of people think this is all there is, but this is just not true. There's 2 volumes. So like I said, it was published serially originally, and then eventually it was the whole story was taken and published into 2 volumes. First volume was called Consuelo, and the second volume was called The Countess of Rudolstadt. Now in English, I don't think there is a physical version of The Countess of Rudolstadt. At least I don't think there's like a full physical version, because there's this one edition, but I don't trust it. It's from, I think, University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, I don't know, but universities published it, I think, and it's like 300 pages, and I don't know why it's so small. I don't know, because The Countess of Rudolstadt that I read was over 600 pages, so I don't know where they're getting the 300 from. I don't know. Don't buy it. Don't trust it. Because I'm going to tell you where you can read the second volume for free. That's right. Isn't it the best when we can read for free? So you can read this physically, ebook, whatever you want, and then the second Countess of Rudolstadt you can read from Project Gutenberg. This is a really good translation. It's a good translation, I promise. It's very nice to read, and you can go on Project Gutenberg and you can download it for free anywhere you read ebooks. So like if you have a Nook app on your phone or like a Kindle app, you can read it there. If you have a physical Nook or like a physical Kindle, you can read it there. So again, I think there are people who don't know that there's a second volume to this, which I was one of those people, okay? I'm saying that because I was one of those people, and there's nowhere on here that mentions a second volume. This book by itself is 799 pages, and when I got to the end of it, I was like, where's the rest of it? What happened? Like, what? Did she pass away? Like, what is going on? I was really confused. And then I found out, you know, I just did a little digging, of course, and I found out, oh, there's a whole nother book. And I actually like volume 2 better than volume 1, so you definitely have to read volume 2. Also, you'll want to read volume 2 because if you finish this, you'll have to read volume 2 because you'll be left unsatisfied. You'll want more. Now, of course, this begs the question, why has no one just published one big chunker? I don't know. All they gotta do is get Consuelo and get the Countess of Rudolstadt and put them together and have one big book. Why has no one done this? Probably because no one will read it, to be honest, because I don't even think that many people have read this book. I, of course, would have preferred putting it all in one volume, but whatever, 1,400 pages, too much for one volume, I guess. But anyways, regarding what this is about, one of my favorite things about it is the variety of topics that it covers, because this covers so many different topics, and it's just the best. A main thing in this book is the Hussite Revolution, also known as the Bohemian Revolution. The Bohemian Revolution was started after the death of John Huss, hence Hussites, John Huss. You see the connection, okay? But he was executed by the Catholic Church for heresy. I would say that John Huss and John Ziska are two important people that are brought up quite a bit in this book. This book takes place in what I believe is the late 1740s and early 1750s is when I think that this takes place in, based on things that happen in the book. The Bohemian Revolution took place in the 1400s. But you're seeing the after effects of that still present and still in the mind and the hearts of the Bohemians, and how they're still not satisfied with the Catholic Church. There's a lot of discussion in here about the Bohemian Revolution, but also that want for reform of the Catholic Church and the disagreement with things of the certain ways of the Catholic Church is also very present in this book. So there's a lot of talk about corruption of the clergymen and the Catholic Church, and questions about the difference between the customs of the Catholic Church versus the ways of Jesus and his apostles and how different this is. There's also a lot of talk about what are the true Christian virtues and Christian apathy, like prayer versus action, just praying for someone, not actually doing things for people and being judgmental and not actually acting in the way that Jesus did. And then there's also a lot of discussion about not just in the Catholic Church, but also corruption amongst the monarchy and the greed in the monarchy. There's discussion about despotism. There's secret societies in this book. There's a lot of... Consuelo is an opera singer. So there's a lot of talk in here about music, about opera, about theater, what it means to be a true artist. I know I said we're going to France for this book because it was written in French, published by a French author, released in France, but it doesn't actually take place in France. You never go to France in this book. In the beginning, it does say Romance of Venice. You start in Venice with Consuelo. She was basically born in Spain, and she traveled around with her mother, and they would sing. They would do opera singing on the streets to earn money. And they end up... they travel lots of different places, but they end up in Venice, and her mom dies in Venice, and Consuelo is singing on the street for money, as they would do, and a musician, not a musician, well, he's a musician, but he was more so a, composer, I think, Purpura, who was there's a lot of real life people in this book, by the way, but Purpura finds her, hears her singing on the street, and so he takes her and enrolls her in this state-funded school that basically trains young people to become choirists for the Catholic Church. There's really only a few characters in this book, including Consuelo, who didn't actually exist. Most of the people in this book were real historical figures. It's just really cool. It's really cool because you see characters in this book, and then later on you could go look up their name and see all the parallels, and it's just really cool knowing they actually existed and stuff. But Consuelo is a figment of George Sand's imagination. I think that's all I can say, actually, isn't it? Yeah. I don't think I can say more than that. I think that's it. She's an opera singer. She's an orphan living in Venice, and she's, things happen. I promise you this book will go in places you never would have thought. You never would have imagined in a million years where this book is gonna go. So I do actually kind of want to tell you the different genres that this book plays around with, but if what I've said so far interests you enough to try the book out, then just skip to the next section. If you don't mind knowing a little bit about where the book goes, then because I just want to tell you because I think it's really cool, okay? But like I said, she plays around with a lot of different genres. And to me, this book is divided into 7 sections. This book in particular has 4 sections. And then the second volume has 3 sections plus an epilogue. Now, it doesn't actually say there's sections, but when you read it, it's like there's sections. It just says the next chapter, but there's section. I would say section 1 takes place in Venice. That's where you start out. Section 2 takes place in Bohemia, and it has a gothic vibe. She's really playing around with gothic themes, and there's a castle and a mysterious man. Understand, is just having fun. And then section 3 is kind of cross-country adventure. She has a companion. They have to escape things and run out of danger, and then section 4 takes place in Vienna, Austria, during the reign of Maria Theresa, who makes an appearance. And then section 5, where we're at, takes place in Berlin during the reign of Frederick the Great. And then sections 6 and 7, those I can't tell you about though, because if I were to tell you what 6 and 7 are, that would really be a spoiler. So I can't. 6 and 7 are a mystery. You're gonna have to read it to find out, but they're so cool. So yeah, it really just plays around with so many different things, and I just think it's fun in that regard. Now, I do have some issues with it, some things that bothered me about it that might not bother other people though. So I would say the one thing about this that at times I was like, George, see, could you just pick up the pace a little bit? Like, come on, just move it along. Basically, it's a little wordy at times. It kind of reminds me of, so I am not the biggest fan of Victorian literature. I've read my fair share, and I've never come across a piece of Victorian literature that I just loved. It's just never happened, because at the end of the day, I find Victorian literature, they just kind of talk too much. I feel like this kind of had the same issue to me at times. But if you like Victorian literature, so if that wordiness doesn't bother you, you probably won't have a problem with it in this book. I just personally am not the biggest fan of Victorian literature, but a lot of people love Victorian literature. So if you like Victorian literature, then you probably don't have to worry about it in this book. It did bother me sometimes. Also, I think Consuelo herself is a very flat character in the beginning. Consuelo is the main character and the whole story is revolving around her, but everyone else is having more character development and more depth than she is. I will say that it does get way better over time. The second volume in particular has so much focus on Consuelo. That might be why it's more of my favorite, because there is so much development of her character in volume 2. It gets better over time, but just be aware that in the beginning you might be annoyed with I don't know, her lack of presence, I would say. But that's it for Consuelo. I really enjoyed it. I think it's fun. If you're looking for a big story to get into, to spend lots of time with, I think you could definitely give this one a try. Did you know Dostoevsky translated some George Sand into Russian? Yeah, look at the roads intertwining. That's right. Let's move on, shall we? As for me, in these days which I have to pass upon earth, I confess that if I had to leave guilty and unhappy souls and sit down at the feet of the just in moral prosperity, I should feel that I was no longer on the road to heaven. I have often seen persons soiled with vice calling the miracles of this saint to their aid, that they might the better conceal their secret iniquities from their fellow men. It is thus that your devout practices serve as often for a cloak to gross hypocrisy as for an aid to innocence. Infirm in body and mind, you will have passed from earth like an unknown saint, like an exiled angel, ignorant of evil, without having known happiness, without even having felt the sun that warms the earth. So rapt were you in the contemplation of the mystic sun which burns in your mind. Now we're going to go to Norway, and specifically when you read this next book, you're going to be in Norway in the medieval ages, and you're going to be following a character named Kristin Lavransdatter, which is the name of this next book. Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset. So this was originally published in 3 books, The Wreath, The Wife, and The Cross, 1920, 1921, 1922, respectively. And you can buy editions that have all 3 separate, so you can buy each book separately. In fact, there's this older edition with these really beautiful covers. Oh, I love them. But you can buy those, or you can buy newer ones that have been published, doesn't matter. But you can also buy a bind up, which is how I read it, where it just puts all 3 together. I think there might even be only one edition. I think the P1 Deluxe edition might be the only one that has them all together. I'm not sure, but that's the one I read, and it was 1,145 pages. But of course, you can read it however you want, all together or all 3. Doesn't matter, it's all the same book. So this isn't my favorite book out of the list, but it's a book that I really appreciate. So I kind of have a weird relationship with it, but I'll explain that further in a minute. Let's talk about Sigrid herself first. So Sigrid was originally born in Denmark, but she moved to the capital of Norway at 2 years old, and that's where she grew up. And eventually she would get a job working as a secretary, I believe in an engineering company. And then while she was doing this, she would write on the side. But eventually she would be able to become a full-time writer and support herself financially with her writing. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff, but I kind of just want to jump to when she starts writing this book specifically, because I think what's really interesting is reading Kristin Lavransdatter, and then once you finish it, going and learning more about Sigrid Undset's life
pre-writing this book, because there's a lot of parallels between Sigrid and Undset in terms of things that happen in their life and decisions that they make. And so it's really interesting to be able to go back after you read the book and see what things in the book Sigrid got from her own experiences. So I'm going to skip all that so that you can do it once you finish the book, because I just think it's fun to do so. So I'll leave that to you to do, but jumping to when she decides to write this book, or when she begins writing it at least. So in 1919, she moves to Littlehammer, which is a municipality in the district of Gudbrand Valley, which is the same valley where Kristin Lavransdatter was raised, but it's a different municipality. But she moves there in 1919 and she starts to build a house, and she moves there with her, I believe she had 2 children at the time and was pregnant with a third. So she moves there and has her 3rd child and gets a divorce and really moves here and focuses on her writing. And so she moves there in 1919, and by 1920 she releases The Wreath, and then each book in the consecutive years after that. And one thing that she's really well known for is her ability to portray the medieval ages in Norway, because Kristin Lavransdatter, like I said, takes place in the medieval ages in Norway, but some of her other books do too. And she would receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1928. And when she received this prize, it was cited that one of the reasons for her receiving it was because of her depictions of the medieval ages. So if you want to read a book where you really feel transported to the medieval ages and really feel like you're experiencing all of these struggles and hardships that come with that, then this would be a great book to pick up for that. And in this book, she does a really good job of creating such a complex character that is Kristin. One of the, I guess, hallmarks about Kristin and about this book is that there are, of course, a lot of restrictions placed on women and how they're supposed to act, and specifically women who are supposed to be considered women of good bearing. They have very strict restraints on how they're supposed to appear and how they're supposed to act and what decisions they're supposed to make. Hallmark of this book is Kristin making her own decisions and not following this strict path that society demands that she follow. And she grew up on an estate called Jorungard. I don't really know how to say it, but her parents are Lavrans and Ragnafrid. Lavrans and Ragnafrid received property from Ragnafrid's father, and that property is Jorungard. It's located in Sel, so again, it's in Gudbrand Valley, which in the book's called Gudbrandsdal. And you can actually visit a replica of, okay, so basically in, I think, was it the 90s? I don't know. I think pre-2000 at least, there was a movie made of Kristin Lavransdatter, although I think it really only deals with the first book, The Wreath. When they filmed this movie, they built a replica of what that estate would have looked like, where Kristin would have grown up. And you can still visit it today, although I think it's only, a very small time of the year that you can visit it, and I think part of the year it's only open to pilgrims. And again, this is not my favorite book on this list, but it is a ton of people's favorites. A lot of people really, really love this book. The only reason for me that causes that weird relationship with it is because Kristin, for me, was such a stressful character. She really put me through it in this book. I just have very emotional reactions to books. I really feel a book, and I really felt this one. Let me tell you, this book wore me out. Like, I really want to read more of Sigrid Undset, but I don't know if I can take it. I don't know if I can handle more. She doesn't have an easy life, just put it that way. This is a hard environment to live in and grow up in, and you really feel that reading this book. But this is why my relationship with it is weird, is because this book really put me through it, but I also really appreciate it. Because how boring would it be if every book you read has a character that just makes all the same decisions that you would? And I really appreciate that this was the main character that Sigrid Undset sought out to write about. In that stress I was feeling, it really made me appreciate how lucky I am to have more autonomy in my decisions and not have the same consequences for just wanting to have autonomy that you would face and that she faces living back in that time period and in that place. So it really does make me appreciate a lot of things. But I do want to remind you that this is a lot of people's favorite book. A lot of people really, really love this book. So if the setting sounds interesting to you, if the experience of Kristin sounds interesting to you, then I would definitely give this book a try. Also, something that people really, really love about this book is the atmosphere. I typically have a hard time reading nature settings, descriptions, I guess I should say. It's just not something that I particularly am that captivated by. But if you are someone who loves really atmospheric writing, then and really beautiful nature descriptions, then you'll probably really love this book, because everyone that I've seen who do enjoy those things absolutely adores this book. So if you really want to feel taken back to the medieval ages and really feel kind of the most authentic experience that you can of what it must have been like to live in that time period, then this book would be perfect for you to read. She had not come to God with her wreath or with her sins and sorrows, not as long as the world still possessed a drop of sweetness to add to her goblet. But now she had come, after she had learned that the world is like an alehouse. The person who has no more to spend is thrown outside the door. She walked as if through a forest. The pillars were furrowed like ancient trees, and into the woods the light seeped, colorful and as clear as song, through the stained glass windows. High overhead, animals and people frolicked in the stone foliage, and angels played their instruments. At an even higher, more dizzying height, the vaults of the ceiling arched upward, lifting the church toward God. In a hall off to the side, a service was being held at an altar. Kristin fell to her knees next to a pillar. The song cut through her like a blinding light. Now she saw how deep in the dust she lay. Next, we are going to go back to Japan, and this time we're going to go to Heian-kyo, which is modern-day Kyoto, and we're going to be going all the way back to the early 1000s at the height of court culture, the height of Fujiwara power in Japan. And the book that we're going to be talking about, you probably already know what it is, but that is The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. I have, of course, talked about this book before because I really love it, and it's really interesting, actually, because I'm tempted to say this is the longest book on the list. I'm like, is Consuelo longer? But the reason I don't think it is, I think this would be the longest book on the list, is because even though just by looking at it you might not notice, but this is actually, the English translations of this typically have over double the word count of The Count of Monte Cristo and almost double the word count of War and Peace. But it's so interesting because if you put this side by side with those books, it obviously looks larger, but it doesn't look that much larger. So it's really interesting when you look at word count, which can be hard to look at because I think it can just be very hard to get accurate word counts of books. But I think this must be the longest book on the list, and I don't really think Consuelo would be longer. And it's definitely better writing than Consuelo. I don't take that. George Sand. Don't be offended, George Sand. Don't be offended, George Sand. I'm just saying. This is a masterpiece of humanity. Different standards. But this has 54 chapters in it. And this translation is by Royall Tyler, but there are multiple other translations. I really love this translation, though. Specifically, the reason I really love it, well, one, this edition has tons of like illustrations in it, which is really cool, and I think really great if you haven't seen a lot of high-end Japan art, or I should say art about high-end Japan. There's not like tons of art surviving from the period specifically, but there is a lot of art made of it after that period. But whatever. I just think the illustrations in here are really great and really helpful. And also something that is so helpful is, let me show you. At the beginning of every chapter, what he does is he has a character list, because there's tons and tons of characters in this book. And I guess it can be kind of hard sometimes to keep it all in check. But I found when I was reading this, I had no problem remembering who was who because of this list at the beginning of every chapter. Because what it would make me do is, at the beginning of every chapter, I would go through this list and I would go through each name and I would mentally remember, like, okay, so Genji, I would remember everything about him. I'd be like, okay, yes, I know who that is. And then I go to the next name and I'm like, okay, yes, I know who that is. So I would go through each one and I would basically remind myself at the beginning of every chapter who was who. Also because the names that people go by will change, because a lot of people go by their government position for men, and then women, a lot of times their name stays consistent, so you don't have to worry about that one. But for the men, their name is always changing depending on their position. I don't think other translators have this at the beginning. I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I only think Royall Tyler has it, but this is really, really helpful. Like, I'm almost tempted to say, read his translation just so that you can have this. So Murasaki Shikibu was most likely born in the 970s. They don't know exactly when, but sometime in the 970s. Most of them seem to agree on that. And really the only certain date that they have, the earliest certain date that they have for her is 1001. So they know that by 1001, she is a widow and has a child. So she got married. They believe she must have got married sometime late in the 990s, but her husband passed away and she has a child by 1001. And then sometime in 1005 to 1006, she becomes a lady in waiting to Empress Shoshi. And Shoshi is also known as Akiko, but she was the daughter of the most powerful man in Japan at the time, Fujiwara no Michinaga, who was regent to the emperor, and the emperor at the time was Emperor Echijo, who Shoshi is married to. But typically empresses at this time, well, not just empresses, but consorts in general, had a salon of ladies around them that could help boost the prestige of that empress. Also, Murasaki Shikibu is not her real name. This was very common. If you'll notice, if you look at really any high-end Japan literature, no one really goes by what their real name would have been. And this was common. Even back then, people didn't usually refer to each other by their real name. They were referred to as nicknames. So if you were a male, a lot of times you were referred to by your government position, but females were typically given nicknames, especially when they entered court service. So looking at Murasaki Shikibu, the Shikibu part of her name came from a post that her father once held in the Shikibusho, which is the Ministry of Ceremonials, similar to Izumi Shikibu. Same connection, same way that they got that Shikibu part. So women, typically part of their nickname would come from a post that a male relative held. And then the Murasaki part of her name is in reference to a character in this book whose name is Murasaki. Like in the Diary of Lady Murasaki, which of course, if you read the Tale of Genji, then you could read this afterwards as a little extra. But in this, there is an instance where I think it was a palace guard, I think it was, but you see her being referred to as Murasaki. Someone's wondering where she is and asks, "Where's little Murasaki?" And she replies something along the lines of, "There's no Genji around here, so why would Murasaki be here?" So basically, most of the scholars of this period, if you would call them that, they typically almost all agree that the Murasaki part of her name comes from people at court starting to refer to her as Murasaki in reference to the Tale of Genji, which she was writing and which was being, certain chapters of it were being circulated at court. People were reading it. It's important to remember that she didn't write herself into the book. Most likely, she was given the nickname Murasaki after she had already created the character Murasaki, and she was given that nickname by other people. So in terms of The rest of her life, as is typical with court ladies, it's just, guesses, speculations. Just like with other ones, that's the same here. There's a lot of different opinions on when she died. Some people say it was in the teens, like 1013 or 1015. Others say she doesn't pass away until the late 1020s or even in the 1030s. But going back to when did she write this book specifically? Well, there's what I see scholars typically believe, and then there's also like a legend around her writing this. I'll tell you both of them. The scholars, they most likely think that she started writing it after her husband passed away. Also in the Diary of Lady Murasaki, which she started writing in 1008, and I think finished in 1010. I think it covers 2 years. But when she started writing that, it's clear that certain chapters have already been written and have been released. They've been copied, and people are reading them at court. So by 1008, parts of the story are already being read by people. And then in terms of when she finished it, no one really knows that either. I would say a safe assumption is in the teens, the second decade, because by the 1022, Sarashina, which is in As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams, this is the Sarashina Nikki. She talks about how in 1022, she had only been able to get a few chapters from different places of the Tale of Genji, and she was really, really, really wanting to read the whole thing. And her aunt brings her 50 chapters, or around like 50 plus chapters of the Tale of Genji. So it doesn't say exactly if it's all 54, it just says more than 50. So at least by 1022, almost the whole thing has been written, if not just the whole entire thing has been written and is in circulation for people to read. Now, the legend of when she started writing it is that when she was in court, someone had asked Empress Shoshi for a monogatari, which is a tale, and Empress Shoshi wanted a new one written. She asked Murasaki to write a new monogatari for the court. Murasaki goes on a pilgrimage to a temple that is on a lake, and while staring up at the moon, she gets the inspiration for her story and writes down not the first 2 chapters, but she writes down 2 chapters. And this starts her process of writing the story. And there's actually a temple in Japan. I don't remember. I mean, I assume it's somewhere near Kyoto, but there's a temple that you can visit that the temple claims to be the temple where Murasaki went and received this inspiration to write the Tale of Genji. So according to the legend, she started writing it while she was in service for Empress Shoshi. That also brings up a point that these chapters were not written in order. She most likely wrote them all out of order. Now, I'm gonna get into the story itself. I'm just gonna explain to you how it starts out. So what you're going to expect in the first few pages. So when the book begins, we are introduced to someone that we refer to as the Kuretsubo. He does a Kuretsubo intimate. I always refer to them as concubines, consorts. There's empress, and then next in ranking is consorts, and the next in ranking is concubines. But he refers to her as the Kuretsubo intimate, which is the same thing as a concubine. I think he's just calling it intimate instead of concubine, but we'll go with what he says, which is the Kuretsubo intimate. And we meet her, and she is explained as being highly favored out of all the emperor's women. So of course he has consorts and he has concubines, and she is a concubine, and she is highly favored, and this causes her to have a very, very difficult time at court, because not only is she favored, but what makes it worse is that she's not even in this hierarchy at the top or even near the top. She's not even a consort. And so this makes everyone extremely jealous of her because she's of lower ranking, but yet the emperor favors her and prefers spending time with her compared to all of his other women that are in his court. And she eventually gives birth to a son, but when he's only 3 years old, she passes away. And she passes away due to her fragile health caused by the distress that this really intense, harsh atmosphere at court causes her. And her son, even from early on as a baby, is seen by everyone at court as having an outstanding character and outstanding beauty. And the emperor favors this son. To the emperor's wishes, he would want to make this son heir apparent, which is, means he would become emperor. But this would be very scandalous if he were to do so, because the natural right to become heir apparent would go to his first wife and highest ranking, which in this is called the Kokiden consort. And she's not only a consort, but she's also his first wife. And so her first son would naturally be the one who is supposed to receive that right. And it would definitely cause an issue at court if he were to appoint the son of the Kurotsubo concubine as heir apparent instead of the Kokiden consort. Also, really quick, a lot of these names, so the Kurotsubo concubine, or sorry, I said I would refer to it as he does, Kurotsubo intimate and the Kokiden consort. These names come from where they live in the palace. What he does, basically, the emperor, is he doesn't just not make this son heir apparent, but he removes him from the imperial line altogether. So Kurotsubo's son, he just removes from the imperial line, which this was common. This basically started at the very beginning of the Heian period because there was an issue, which is kind of an ongoing issue throughout the period, of finances, a financial issue. And in an effort to help with the finances, the emperor starts removing people from the imperial family and placing them into clans. And this is something that the emperor does for Kurotsubo's son. So he removes him from the imperial family and gives him a clan name, because people of the imperial family do not have a clan name. And so if you're removed from the imperial family and you become a noble commoner, you are given a clan name. And this is where the name comes from, because the Kurotsubo's son, when he's taken out of the imperial family, he is given into the Minamoto clan, which is also read, the character from Minamoto is also read as Genji. So people of Minamoto clan are also known as the Genji clan. And so hence, this is where Genji comes in. That's why he's called Genji, because that's his clan name. So this has a lot of benefits for Genji, because one, it means that he will not be seen as a threat at court. He's not going to have to live with people always suspecting that he could make some move for the throne, because he's not in the imperial family anymore. And then also, it gives him a lot more freedom as a commoner. There's a lot more restrictions placed on you if you're in the imperial family. But as a commoner, he is given all of that freedom of being a commoner, but he still has all the wealth of being a son of the emperor. And so this is very advantageous for Genji. Also, I know he's always called, or people refer to him as Prince Genji, but he's not really a prince, right? It's weird because I guess in what we would consider a prince, you just think, oh, the son of like a king, so he would be a prince. But technically, in their world, he's not a prince because he's taken out of the imperial family. And also, even when he was in the imperial family, he still wouldn't have been a prince, because that's a title that the emperor has to bestow on you. So yeah, a lot of people refer to him as prince, but I guess technically he's not a prince, and he never technically was a prince. I don't know, it doesn't really matter, I guess. You can call him Prince Genji if you want. I'm just saying technically, I don't think he is a prince. Technically, he's not a prince. And even if you want to say in the imperial family he was a prince, he gets taken out. So he's not a prince for basically his whole life, mostly. But you can call him prince if you want. That's just being ridiculous, dude. That's just being like really particular. Just saying technically, I don't think he's a prince. But even what's his name calls him a prince? Ivan Morris. The world of the Shining Prince. The scholars call him prince. So what do I know? Also, I think he's referred to Shining Prince in here. because that's a nickname that he's given at court because people see him as so marvelous that they start calling him the Shining Prince. But is it the translation thing? Is it the translation error? Don't come at me. Say, what do you, dumb Danny, know to all these scholars? I'm not saying I know anything. Call him Prince if you want. Call him I'm just saying, if you want to be really exact, not the Prince. Say nobleman. I get why they call him Prince. I get it. I get why they call him Prince, you know? But basically, whatever, none of that matters. Basically, this whole book follows his whole entire life. And the generation after him, if you will. But just one generation of descendants. And he is a very passionate, lustful, emotional, romantic man. And you know, when you start reading this book, you might kind of be like, who is this dude? What's this nasty guy doing? And some things you might just be a little like taken aback by. But what's really interesting is as you continue reading, you kind of start to be like, maybe he's not so bad after all. Maybe he's not so bad after all. Compared to what a lot of other men do in this book, you kind of were like, maybe Genji's not so bad after all. I think something that I really enjoy about this book is how, in showing how their society operates, I think Murasaki shows so clearly how none of these societal rules make anyone happy and how constrained it makes their lives. And I just love it. I love it so much. I love it so much. I also, out of every ancient book that I've ever read, this is it's weird to me to say this is ancient because it's 1000 AD, but technically it's before medieval Japan. The period after this, the Kamakura period, is entering into the medieval ages. So it's just really weird to say it's ancient world, but it's because it's on like the cusp. But technically it is a part of ancient literature. And out of every book of ancient literature that I've ever read, this holds such a special place in my heart because out of everything, I've never seen a piece of ancient literature give as much psychological detail to women as it does in this book. This book is filled with female characters, and female characters that all have so much depth and so much time given to them, so much development of their character, and so much time and space given to their own feelings and their own experiences, which is so rare in ancient literature. Most of the time in ancient literature, I mean, women are never really the main character, and if they are, they're very, very simple, one-dimensional. They kind of just seem like moving chess pieces for the real heroes of the story, the real characters of the story, which are always guys. And there's a lot of things in this book that are hard to read. A lot of the things that women have to go through in this book, or just a lot of the socially acceptable ways that they're treated or viewed. It's hard to read, but I think even though it's hard to read, I appreciate that I'm able to read it because this is what their lives were like. This is the reality of what these women in the aristocracy in Heian Japan had to deal with. And so even though it's hard, I appreciate that in the ancient world, there exists a book that actually lets us know what it was like for these group of women in particular, because that's so rare in so much ancient literature. You don't get that. You don't have to see the full depth and the full horror of what they have to go through because they're just not important. Whereas in here, the women are given so much space and their experiences are so fully explored in this book. It's just so rare in any other ancient society where you have not just a book of ancient literature like this, but so many books written by women. The Heian Japan period is just so unique in that it has so many different works from female authors, which is such an anomaly for ancient literature. I also really love just how much this book engulfs you in high-end Japan culture, because it is so different from our own, or just my own specifically. It's like, it's hard to even imagine really putting yourself in the situation, because it's just so different. And I think one aspect that's really cool about this is the influence of religion on these people's lives, and just how different it is, in the sense that they have a really big mix of different religions. And you'll see in this book how, for the aristocracy, which is what this book's focusing on, this book is focusing on the richest population of high-end Japan. Festivals and ceremonies are such a huge part of their daily lives, and also they have so many superstitions, which is so cool to read. Like, they have so many taboo days and auspicious days and unlucky directions, and they're constantly having to work around this and plan their life accordingly to these things. And they also have unlucky activities on certain days that are based entirely on the day they were born and when they were born. And they just have this huge influence of yin yang on their culture from China. And there's just a really big mix of Buddhism, Shintoism, and yin yang, which Shintoism, they didn't call it that at the time, but like their native Japanese religion, which is where a lot of their superstitions come from. Like, they have a lot of superstition around defilement, which comes from death, sickness, and childbirth, and constantly having to be conscious of this as well. Like, it's just has a really big impact on their daily lives and how they go about their daily lives. And also, this book just really breathes Buddhism. And Buddhism at this time was really just prevalent amongst the aristocracy. Buddhism wouldn't really become prevalent in the lower classes until the next period, the Kamakura period. You see how huge of an influence Buddhism has on them, and how much Buddhism has infiltrated their culture. You really see how they view the world in this light, that the world is an illusion, focusing on the transitory nature of life and how much suffering is in existence, and the constant desire to be able to end their cycle of rebirth and be born in paradise. And how much they view I think what's interesting is not just how much they view earthly materialistic things, which obviously you would understand why that would be viewed as a inhibitor to receiving enlightenment, but I think it's also interesting how much they view human relationships as an inhibitor to receiving enlightenment. And I just really loved the Buddhism influence on this book, and how every page just breathes the Buddhism that has infiltrated their culture. You also see in this book something that's so completely different, and that is how much poetry was important to their culture, and how important it was for just their daily communication. So there is a lot of poetry that you will read in this book, and I think in general, poetry is really hard to translate from what I've noticed. I think the best translator of high-end Japan poetry that I have read is Edwin A. Cranston, of course, but he does not obviously translate the poetry here. I've read quite a bit of stuff on the people who translate high-end Japan literature into any modern language, not just English, and I have so much respect for them. Literally so much respect. When you realize how difficult it really is translating, I mean, obviously just translating in general is difficult, but translating from an ancient script to a modern one, when you really realize that, it just makes a book seem almost like a miracle. I almost feel just Royall Tyler, hey man, thanks. You put in the work so people like me don't have to, and we can just enjoy this story. So thank you so much. Also, thank you to there's a lot of other prominent translators, but holding this in my hand, it just feels like such a miracle, and I feel so grateful and thankful for the people who devote their lives to early Japanese literature and working so hard to be able to translate it and translate it well, and I just appreciate them so much. I just love this book so much, and you should definitely read it. It is such a slow, quiet experience. I don't know how else to describe it. I think in the past I've described it as a sigh, but it's a beautiful sigh, and a sigh that again, I really appreciate, and I feel so grateful that this book has continued to exist and has survived, and I feel so grateful for all of the people throughout Japanese history who continue to copy this book. Thanks, unknown Japanese copyists throughout Japanese history. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. I see your effort. And I'm very thankful. Make sure you read the book. Leave me, if you will, burdened with your bitterness through all lives to come. But know your real enemy is your heart, and yours alone. Like unmelted snow, I linger reluctantly, and in my darkness find that I cannot be sure who I am or where I go. Even when he was home again, his eyes remained on the moon, and his heart wandered off into the skies. When I only longed to melt from this sorry world as this snow will soon, how strange still to linger on once again to watch it fall. We are now at our final book. What could it be? What could be the last book in this video? Where will we go? We are going to go to Italy. Specifically, northeast Italy. And even more specifically, if you want, we go to Venice. This is a book that was written between 1857 and 1858 in only about 8 months, which is crazy. But that book is called Confessions of an Italian by Ippolito Nievo. I don't know if it's Nievo. I don't know. I've never heard anyone say his name before. I don't know how you pronounce it exactly, but I love his first name, Ippolito. This is a book that takes place during a really vital part of Italian history, and that is specifically the unification of Italy. And this deals with that whole entire really long process that it took for Italy to go from being a collection of a bunch of different countries and city-states to finally being united once again, like it had been back almost 1,000 years previously under the Roman Empire. I didn't know how old he was when I read this, and then when I finished the book, I went and looked him up because I like to do all of my research into the author and the history after I read it, because a lot of times if you try to do it before you read it or while you're reading it, you just get spoilers. So I always wait till I'm finished with the book. And so I went and I looked up him and I saw he was like 26, 27, and I was so impressed, especially considering how short of time he took to write this. I don't know, it's very impressive to me. I think with this book, I'm going to give you a really summarized account of this process of the unification of Italy, because there's so much to it, and I'm really gonna have to try and hold myself in to not tell you everything that I want to tell you about this whole process, because there's so much history around it and just so much detail. But I'm gonna give you a summarized timeline so that you have it figured out in your head, if you will, have it all laid out properly so that you can understand and appreciate this book better. So I'm going to start with the French Revolutionary Wars. So in the French Revolutionary Wars, you have the War of the First Coalition and the War of the Second Coalition. So in the War of the First Coalition, you have Napoleon, who at the time is not this big famous general, but he is put in charge of the Italian front of the French armies, which was not a very successful front. When he goes to the army, it is very depleted, not doing well, and he goes to the Italian front and he invades Italy. So he basically goes and defeats Piedmont, Sardinia, I think only within a month of starting this invasion. And then he focuses east on getting the Austrians out of northern Italy. And it's important to know that at this time, the city of Venice was still its own sovereign state known as the Republic of Venice. And the Republic of Venice had existed for a little over 1,000 years at this point. And they were saying they were neutral. You have the French and the Austrians fighting, and the Republic of Venice is trying to do what it can to keep its neutrality. And so as Napoleon gets over to the Republic of Venice, the territories in the Republic of Venice, they let him in. They let him into the Republic of Venice so that he can go after the Austrians because they're neutral. Well, he ends up taking over Venice. And this War of the First Coalition ends with a treaty called the Campo Formio, I believe. France gets a bunch of Austrian territories that are in the region of Lombardy, and France gets certain territories from the Republic of Venice, and Venice itself, the city, gets handed over to Austria. Then Napoleon leaves Italy and he goes on an Egyptian campaign, and then he goes back to France and becomes first consul. And during this time, the Austrians take this chance of Napoleon not being in Italy anymore to reinvade Italy and regain their territories. And they are pretty successful in this. They almost completely get the French out of northern Italy before Napoleon then comes back and reconquers northern Italy and takes it all back. So it can be confusing because there's just so much change going on at this time, but don't worry. I explain it all, it will make sense, okay? Because we gotta keep going. So basically, Napoleon ends up creating republics in Italy. Part of it becomes under the French Empire, and then he creates some other republics. And then eventually, fast forward to 1814, Napoleon is considered defeated. Of course, he comes back in 1815 with like Waterloo, but they considered him defeated in 1814. And so they create the Congress of Vienna, and the Congress of Vienna runs from 1814 to 1815. And in the Congress of Vienna, and I'm just talking about Italy specifically, but of course in the Congress of Vienna, they're dealing with all of Europe. But in regards to Italy, they decide how to, now that Napoleon has been defeated, how are we going to take Italy and divide it up again? Who's going to rule what, and what are the territorial boundaries going to look like? And this Congress basically decides to make Italy just basically go back to what it looked like before Napoleon. This causes a lot of issues though, because now Italy is put back under all of these absolute monarchies and under all of this foreign rule. But what's different now compared to pre-Napoleon was that all of these ideas of the French Revolution have been introduced to Italians. There is a lot of resistance to being forced back under these absolute monarchies. The Italians have these more liberal nationalistic ideas that they have been introduced to. This makes the period following 1815 very turbulent in regards to, there is just a lot of uprisings. You have certain figures that become kind of the beacons of Italian unification and liberation from foreign powers like Mazzini and Garibaldi. You have this emergence of this desire called, they typically called the Risorgimento, this fight for the unification of Italy and having all of Italy, all of the Italian peninsula under one rule. You have this long fight of Italians wanting freedom from foreign control over Italy. They want to be ruled by Italians. They want to have constitutions. They want to have freedom from oppression by these absolute monarchies. They want people to be able to receive rank and advancements in their career based on their talent and ability, not just based on their nobility status or where they were born, who they were born to. So you see a lot of uprisings and dissatisfaction with the government in the 1820s and in the 1830s, and then specifically in 1848 you have, it's kind of known as the revolutions of 1848 because you have a series of uprisings that happen all over Europe against monarchies, or absolute monarchies specifically, and you have some very notable ones that happen in Italy as well. And eventually you have Piedmont Sardinia declaring war on Austria. They're defeated, and then they make a secret kind of deal with France where they kind of invoke Austria to declare war on Piedmont Sardinia, and then the France come to Piedmont Sardinia's aid. So in 1859 there is a treaty signed, and it basically gives all of Lombardy over to Piedmont, Sardinia. But what became a very big disappointment for Italian nationalists was the city of Venice itself still was given to Austria. So Venice itself does not become liberated from this. And this was a very big disappointment to a lot of Italian nationalists who were fighting under Piedmont, Sardinia, and kind of putting their hopes in Piedmont, Sardinia becoming the kingdom that can rule and unite all of Italy. Then in 1860, and I swear we're getting closer to the end of this, I swear, in 1860, we're getting closer, much, much closer to unification. Garibaldi, who also fought in the 1859 in the north against the Austrians, but in 1860, he takes what's known as the Thousand, and they go to Sicily. So Sicily was under the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, Sicily as well as southern the southern part of the Italian peninsula, and he goes over to Sicily with just around 1,000 men, and they take over and invade Sicily. And then they go over to the mainland, which in Spanish rule in Italy, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies is annexed to Piedmont, Sardinia. So you can see how Piedmont, Sardinia is now starting to get a lot more territory in Italy and almost has all of the territory in Italy, thus getting closer to this idea of a united Italy, all of the Italian peninsula under one ruler. And in 1861, specifically March 17th of 1861, Piedmont, Sardinia changes its name and declares the Kingdom of Italy on March 17th of 1861 with Emmanuel II as the king. So they declare this Kingdom of Italy, but the complete unification process isn't considered complete at this time until 1870, because when they declare the Kingdom of Italy in 1861, they still don't have Venice and they don't have Rome. But by 1870, they've gotten Venice and then they finally get Rome. So by 1870, you now have the Kingdom of Italy, which encompasses all of the Italian peninsula, and Rome is established as the capital. So this process of unification is considered ended in 1870, and for the first time in well over 1,000 years, Italy is now finally under one ruler once again and is being ruled by Italians. So you can see this is a very long process that is very important for this book, because this character in this book, his name is Carlo. I don't remember his last name. Altoviti, Carlo Altoviti. He is born in 1775. So as you can see, based on the timeline, he is born right before this period where Napoleon invades Italy. So you can see that the character of this book is going to be living through this whole period that is getting rid of the old regimes and this old world order, and it's the process of bringing in the new and Italy uniting and people, revolutionaries rising up and Italy uniting under one country. Now, going to the author Ippolito, he also lived through this time period. In fact, he was born, like I said previously, in 1831 in Padua, which is like right next to Venice. And so he was kind of born at the height of this Risorgimento. He was born in a period where there's already this big push for unification. And he very much becomes a proponent of this desire for unification and liberation of Italy. So he's born in 1831 in Padua. He eventually graduates in 1855 from the University of Padua with a law degree, and then he begins his literary career. And in 1857, the very end, like December of 1857, is when he begins writing the Confessions of an Italian. And he ends in 1858. And he's not able to get Confessions published, but it would be published very soon after he passes away, but it would be published under a different name. And it would not be published in English until the 50s, like 1950s, but it would be a heavily abridged version that's called the Castle of Frata. So this fully unabridged English translation was done in 2014. So this was the first time that it was ever fully published into English. It's like over 10 years ago. But after he writes the Confessions, In 1859, he goes up north. And remember, in 1859, Piedmont Sardinia, with French aid, is fighting the Austrians to try and kick them out of northern Italy. And he goes up to join this fight. He goes up to participate in fighting for Italian independence, and he joins Piedmont Sardinian forces to fight against the Austrians. And specifically, he joins under Garibaldi in the Alps. So he goes to the Alps to fight Austrian forces there under Garibaldi, who is a very, very prominent figure of Italian unification. The next year, in 1860, that is when he also joins Garibaldi again to go to Sicily. So he is a part of this 1,000. But when Garibaldi leaves the island of Sicily to go to mainland Italy, Ippolito, stays in Sicily, and he is given charge of the accounting for the army. And basically what ends up happening is he gets accused by Piedmont Sardinian government, specifically people under the Cavour, the Count of Cavour, who was the prime minister. He gets accused of financial malpractice. Ippolito then decides to take a ship and takes his accounting books to go over to Naples and to defend himself against these accusations of malpractice. But what ends up happening is he boards a ship, and this ship ends up getting destroyed in a storm. And no one on the ship survives, and this includes Ippolito. And Ippolito's body is never found. This ends up happening on March 4th of 1861, which, if you remember the timeline, is just 2 weeks before the Kingdom of Italy is declared, before a unified Italy is declared by Piedmont Sardinia. So Ippolito Nievo passes away when he is just 30 years old. And going to Confessions, this book is basically told from the perspective of an 80-plus-year-old Carlo, who, it's now 1858, and he's lived through this whole process. He was born in 1755, and he is recounting his life story because he points out that he recognizes that this is a very vital point in Italian history, and maybe his account of his life, his experience, could be useful to further generations of Italians. And I really love, by the way, the very beginning of this book where he is talking to us as an 80-plus-year-old man. It doesn't last for that long, but I really love this beginning part, but whatever. So the very beginning of his childhood, I'll tell you the first page of what he says. Carlo is basically raised in Fratta, the castle of Fratta, which is next to Venice. So like Ippolito, Carlo is born and raised in the region of Venetia, which I think today they call it Veneto, I think. And I really love books like this because a lot of times I feel that history, the way it's talked about, it just seems so unempathetic. And I don't know if that's just me being too sensitive, but sometimes the way people talk about history makes me kind of sad because I almost feel like they completely forget that these things affected everyday people just like you and me. And I love books like this because it reminds you of that. Carlo is a very average person. He's not special. He's not one of these very powerful, influential people. He is just an everyday Italian. And you get to see what this period of transition in Italy was like from the perspective of an everyday person, which is also so important to history because a lot of times with history, you're just always talking about the most important players, the most influential people. But the experience that everyday people had is also just as important. I really love books like this because it takes that 360 view of history and really zooms in on it and gives you a personal perspective of what this was like. And I think it's classics like this that allow you to look at a time period and history and actually connect with the people in history, connect with the people in that time period. And I think it allows a lot of emotion to be brought back into history. And I just love it. I love it so much because it just gives such a personal human feel to history. I think it's also interesting how, because Ippolito, he, from what I discussed with you earlier, he was very much involved in the Risorgimento. But yet in this book, you might think that this is going to be a book that focuses very heavily on the positives of this fight for liberty, this fight for liberation, unification. But he really shows both sides. You really see the negative sides of all of these revolutions, all of this war, and the way that northern Italy specifically is just, I don't want to say destroyed, but the destruction that is caused in northern Italy from all of these wars, from all of these countries that don't care about the inhabitants, don't care what they're going through. They're just all vying for power and more territory, as countries do. And he really shows how he does believe that fighting for your country is the most respectful thing to do. Having the courage to go and fight for what you believe in is what he clearly stands for in this book, but he doesn't just have this completely glorified depiction of it. He shows the sadness that's going to come with that, the way that it's going to destroy parts of your lives with that, and he really shows the negative side effects. And I just think that the way he writes this book and the views that he expresses in it, the tone that's expressed in it, is so interesting when you consider Ippolito's life in conjunction with it. I just really love this book, and I really suggest that you read it. You should definitely give it a try. And not only if you have been interested in Italian unification before, should you read this, because obviously if you like Italian history, then you definitely should read this, but also even if you don't have a concern, you don't have a care for it, you should still read this book because it's so good. And Ippolito was such a great writer, and I really love the main character of this, by the way, Carlo. I really like him. But yeah, I highly suggest this book, and you should give it a try. My experiences may thus offer a sort of model of those innumerable individual destinies that, from the collapse of the old political orders to the patching together of the present one, make up the greater Italian destiny. And what did all this leave me clenching in my hand? Remorse. Intoxicated but not satiated, ashamed but unrepentant. I had abandoned love's ways for that of exile, but if the police hadn't bothered to warn me, I might have stayed to profane Venice's funeral with my shameless pleasures. He was truly the new Charlemagne, and he knew it. For my part, though, I was proud to pass by him without bending my knee. You are a giant, but not a god, I said. I've taken your measure and find my faith much greater and nobler than you. And now we are finally at the end. Can you even believe it? We're finally at the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that if you love big books, you were able to find another one here that you might like to read, or maybe multiple, I don't know. But I hope that you enjoyed this video and have fun reading your big books, the best books.